Hey, everybody. Just a quick chat this morning on Monday the 8th about Beowulf, which is the next text that we'll be reading together. I wanted to just talk briefly about why we're reading this book in this course. One of the things I was really interested to see after reading the quizzes from you guys over the weekend is that many of you have not read Lord of the Rings, which I guess shouldn't surprise me because these books came out in the 1930s, and even though the movies came out earlier this in the 21st century, it might be that not everybody went back to read the 1,000 pages of Lord of the Rings as soon as the movies came out. So I think I am going to revise our syllabus a little bit so that we read large chunks of the Lord of the Rings together. We won't have to read the whole thing because it is endless, although I strongly recommend it. And if you sort of get into the adventure of it, I think you might enjoy just sort of plowing through the big fat chapters of that book or that trilogy. It's really one book broken into three books. But we're also going to do some of the reading in medieval texts, primarily medieval texts that are the great sources for British fantasy. And that begins with the epic poem Beowulf. This is the edition of it that I asked you guys to buy. There's also PDFs of it up on our site already. Beowulf is an extremely interesting and somewhat confusing poem. Confusing historically, meaning that we don't know that much about it. It exists in one anonymous copy that is in the British Museum in London, which was probably made sometime between the 9th and the 11th century. We don't know exactly when, and we don't know exactly who wrote it or who composed the poem or who wrote it down. There is pretty clear evidence that there's two different scribes who contributed to the manuscript in the BL, but we don't know that much about them, and we don't really know, we don't have a clear sense of whether it was composed in the 9th century, composed in the 11th century. The events it describes, which feature monsters and magic, seem to take place in some kind of heroic, idealized version of the 8th or 9th century, the sort of the period in English history before the arrival of Christianity and larger contact with central parts of Europe. It's primarily about Scandinavia, Sweden, and Geatland, which is another part of the northern archipelago, and it's mainly about a superhero named Beowulf and the three monsters who he subsequently battles, sort of one after the other. A monster named Grendel in the first part, Grendel's mother, who tries to take revenge on Beowulf after Beowulf successfully defeats Grendel, and then in the third section, a dragon, and there's a kind of big break between the Grendel's mother section and the episode of the dragon at the end. This poem is the origin of British heroic literature in a lot of ways. It's also for Tolkien himself. Tolkien was a specialist in ancient Northern European languages, including Old English, the language in which this poem was composed, and he taught this poem, he studied this poem, he wrote about this poem, he did his own translation of the poem that I'll refer to occasionally over the next couple of weeks, and he himself was deeply obsessed with the poem. The version of the poem, or the translation of the poem we're reading now, is a brand new one by a feminist kind of punk rock translator named Maria Devana Headley, who is also a writer of YA novels and fantasy novels. And she's going to provide a really lively, fun, feminist, and kind of irreverent rearticulation of the poem that in the hands of someone like Tolkien is a little bit more, well, courtly is the phrase that she uses in her introduction to describe the thing that Tolkien admires in the poem that she herself doesn't want to bring forward. So what I'd like you guys to do over the next couple days, in the beginning part of this week, is to read her introduction, which is a little bit long, but it's very chatty, and it gives a sense of why Beowulf speaks to her as a figure in the modern world, and what this translation might do. And then as soon as you're ready, by Tuesday or Wednesday, say, start reading the first section of the poem. I divided up the PDFs into four sort of sections, basically thinking of, we'll do 2 per week, one in the first half of the week and one in the second half of the week. We'll read Beowulf over the course of 2 weeks of class. I'll put up some discussion threads. I'll be happy to take questions, and we'll talk more specifically about Beowulf and about the monsters whom he fights. And I want you to use the Cohen monster theses as a kind of a lens or a way to think about Beowulf. One of the great observations I think that many people make about this poem is that there's a kind of intimate connection between the hero and the villain. The hero, Beowulf, and the monsters, Grendel's mother, the dragon, are equally kind of unlike all the other humans in the narrative. There's a lot of people who try to be warriors or try to be heroes or try to be kings, but there's only one Beowulf, and he is as unlike other humans as creatures like Grendel and Grendel's mother and the dragon are unlike other creatures. So with that in mind, we will start that up this week, and I look forward to continuing our exchanges on the discussion threads.